Last question. What does Jesus mean when he said, I came to fulfill the law? He means what he said before he took his last breath. It is finished. When he says, I came to fulfill the law, it is finished. He was the sin offering. He offered his life so that you could have one. So he came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. Meaning, the grace of God, by coming down in human flesh and sacrificing himself for you, the grace of God by doing that is sufficient. But when he says, I did not came to abolish it, means that obeying his commands will, number one, show him that you love him. And number two, his grace is sufficient for those who thirst for righteousness. His grace is sufficient for those who are poor in spirit. His grace is sufficient for those who mourn. His grace is sufficient for those who are meek. His grace is sufficient who in the hunger for righteousness will fall and make mistakes. His grace is sufficient for you to get back up and continue. His grace is sufficient for the merciful, for the pure in heart, for the peacemakers. His grace is sufficient for those who love him and want to do right by his side and are pursuing holy fear of God and are pursuing holiness and are pursuing him at all costs. His grace is sufficient for those. But he says, I did not came to abolish the law, because his grace will not be sufficient in the day of judgment for those who treat it lightly. Listen, when you obey God, there can be always mistakes. And grace makes room for growth, but grace will never make room for lawlessness. Grace will never make room for denial of Jesus. Listen, I just want to say this before we pray. God died so that you could live. Go find that life.